At the grocery store, my daughter-in-law told the clerk, "That old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her." My son and grandson burst out laughing. They had no idea I owned the store. That same day, I canceled the inheritance. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I should have known something was wrong when Meadow insisted on coming grocery shopping with us. My daughter-in-law rarely did anything that didn't benefit her directly, but there she was, perfectly made up at 10 in the morning. Her blonde hair swept into an elegant bun, designer purse clutched tightly in her manicured hands. "Come on, Grandma Bessie," my grandson Judd called from the back seat of Blaine's SUV. "We're going to get ice cream after shopping." At 70 years old, I still felt a flutter of joy when Judd included me in their plans. It happens so rarely these days. I climbed into the back seat next to him, my arthritis making the movement slower than I would have liked. Meadow glanced back at me with barely concealed irritation. "Try not to embarrass us in there," she muttered under her breath. Just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that Blaine, my own son, wouldn't catch it from the driver's seat. I said nothing. I'd learned over the years that responding to Meadow's little digs only made things worse. Blaine would inevitably take her side, and I'd be left feeling even smaller than before. The grocery store was busy for a Tuesday morning. Families with young children, elderly couples moving slowly through the aisles, and busy professionals grabbing lunch items. I'd been shopping at Morrison's Market for over 30 years, long before Meadow even knew my son existed. The familiar aisles and friendly faces usually brought me comfort. We made our way through the store, Meadow directing our path with the efficiency of a military commander. She had a list, and heaven help anyone who deviated from it. Judd stayed close to his mother, occasionally glancing at me with what I hoped was affection but might have just been polite acknowledgement. When we reached the checkout, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. The young man behind the register, probably in his early 20s with kind eyes and a genuine smile, began scanning our items. He looked up at me and smiled warmly. "Good morning, ma'am. How are you doing today?" Before I could respond, Meadow stepped between us, her voice sharp and cutting. "This old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her." The words hit me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt heat rush to my cheeks. The young cashier's face fell, confusion replacing his friendly demeanor. He looked from Meadow to me, clearly uncomfortable with what he'd just witnessed. But worse than Meadow's words was what happened next. Blaine, my own son, the boy I'd raised and sacrificed for, burst into laughter. It wasn't just a chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was full, hearty laughter, as if what Meadow had said was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Judd joined in, his 12-year-old voice adding to the chorus of humiliation. "Yeah, Grandma's like our servant," he said between giggles, clearly parroting something he'd heard at home. I stood there, frozen, my hands gripping the handle of my old purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. The cashier's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching pity, and that somehow made it worse. He stopped making eye contact with me entirely, directing all his comments to Meadow and treating me like I truly was invisible. "Paper or plastic?" he asked Meadow, his voice noticeably cooler than it had been moments before. "Plastic," she replied smugly, clearly satisfied with how the interaction had gone. Other customers in line were staring now. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed amused by the family drama playing out in front of them. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never face another human being again. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation. It was the realization that this was how my own family saw me. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not even as a person worthy of basic respect. I was the help. I was something to be managed and controlled and occasionally mocked for entertainment. As we walked to the car, Meadow linked her arm through Blaine's, chattering happily about dinner plans. Judd skipped ahead, already having forgotten about what had happened, and I followed behind them like the servant they'd painted me as, carrying their groceries and my shame in equal measure. The drive home was torture. They discussed their weekend plans, a spa day for Meadow and a golf outing for Blaine, while I sat silently in the back seat, still processing what had happened. Nobody mentioned the ice cream we'd promised to get. Nobody asked if I was okay. When we arrived home, I carried the groceries into the kitchen while they dispersed to their various activities. I put everything away mechanically, my mind numb with shock and hurt. This was my life. This was what I'd become. But as I stood alone in that kitchen, something deep inside me began to shift. For the first time in years, I started to question whether this was really the life I deserved. The silence in my small bedroom felt heavier than usual that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the same clothes from our disastrous shopping trip, unable to find the energy to change. The events at Morrison's Market played over and over in my mind like a broken record I couldn't turn off. This old woman is the maid. Each time I remembered Meadow's words, they cut deeper. But it wasn't just her cruelty that haunted me. It was Blaine's laughter. My own son, the baby I'd held in my arms, the child I'd worked 3 jobs to support after his father left us, had laughed at my humiliation. I looked around my bedroom, really looked at it for the first time in months. It was the smallest room in the house, barely big enough for a twin bed and a dresser. When Meadow moved in 5 years ago, she'd suggested I take this room so they could have the master suite. "It makes more sense," she'd said with that sweet smile that never reached her eyes. "We need more space for our things." I'd agreed, of course. I always agreed. It was easier than fighting. Easier than being labeled difficult or ungrateful. After all, they were letting me live in their house, weren't they? At least, that's how Meadow always framed it, even though I'd been living here for 15 years before she ever set foot through the door. My reflection in the small mirror across the room showed a woman I barely recognized. When had I become so small? When had I started shrinking into myself, apologizing for taking up space in my own home? My gray hair was pulled back in the same practical bun I'd worn for years. My clothes were neat but old, chosen more for durability than style. I looked exactly like what Meadow had called me, the help. But I wasn't always like this. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the woman I used to be, before Frank left, before Blaine grew up and got married, before I learned to make myself invisible to keep the peace. I used to run a small catering business from this very kitchen. Nothing fancy, just home-cooked meals for local families and small events. But it was mine. I was good at it, too. People would specifically request my pot roast and my apple pie. I had regulars who booked me months in advance for their dinner parties and family gatherings. That was before Meadow decided my business was embarrassing and inappropriate for someone of my age. She convinced Blaine that I needed to retire, that having strangers in and out of the house was dangerous. One by one, she found reasons why I couldn't take on new clients. Too much mess in the kitchen, too much noise, too much disruption to their lives. Within a year of her moving in, my business was gone, and with it, my independence and sense of purpose. I became what she wanted me to be, the live-in babysitter and housekeeper who worked for room and board. But tonight, sitting in the darkness of my tiny room, I remembered something else. Something I'd almost forgotten in my daily routine of cooking, cleaning, and staying out of the way. I walked to my closet and moved aside the old coats and dresses I rarely wore anymore. Behind them, pushed far to the back, was a small safe I'd installed years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the combination. Numbers that represented the date Frank had left us. Some people might have found it painful to use that date, but for me, it represented survival. Inside the safe were documents Meadow and Blaine knew nothing about. Bank statements, investment records, property deeds. After Frank left, I'd been terrified of being financially vulnerable again. Every penny I could spare from my catering business, every small inheritance from distant relatives, every careful investment I'd made over the years, it was all here, carefully documented and quietly growing. I pulled out the most recent statements and studied them by lamplight. Over the decades, my careful investments had grown substantially. I owned 3 rental properties downtown, had a diversified investment portfolio, and yes, I owned 40% of Morrison's Market, the very place where I'd been humiliated today. The previous owner, Bill Morrison, had been one of my catering clients. When he'd wanted to expand but needed investors, I'd quietly provided the capital in exchange for a partnership. It was all perfectly legal and documented, but I'd never mentioned it to Blaine or Meadow. Why would I? They'd only find ways to involve themselves, to take control, to make decisions about my money and my business relationships. I'd learned early in Meadow's residency here that any sign of independence or financial stability was seen as a threat to her control. When I'd mentioned having some savings, she'd immediately started suggesting ways I could help them with various expenses. When I'd mentioned owning a small rental property, she'd begun hinting that I should sell it and give them the proceeds for Judd's college fund, so I'd stopped mentioning anything. I let them believe I was entirely dependent on their generosity, that I had nothing and no one else. It kept the peace, even if it meant sacrificing my dignity. But tonight, looking at these documents, I realized I'd sacrificed more than dignity. I'd sacrificed myself. The woman who had built this small empire of investments and properties wasn't weak or helpless. She was smart, resourceful, and independent. She was someone who deserved respect, not someone who should accept being called the maid by her own family. I carefully returned the documents to the safe, but I didn't close it immediately. Tomorrow, I would make some phone calls. I would visit some offices I hadn't been to in far too long. I would start remembering who I really was underneath all these years of trying to be what they wanted. As I finally changed into my nightgown and prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. This time, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had been playing a role for so long she'd forgotten it was just an act. But every performance had to end sometime. 3 days after the grocery store incident, I was returning from my afternoon walk when I heard voices coming from the living room. The front door was slightly ajar, and Meadow's distinctive laugh carried through the house. She was entertaining again, which meant I was expected to make myself scarce until her guests left. I was about to head to my room when I heard my name mentioned. Something in the tone made me freeze at the bottom of the stairs, my hand gripping the banister. Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can stand having her around, Meadow was saying, her voice carrying that particular edge it got when she thought she was being clever. She shuffles around here like some kind of ghost, always underfoot. Can't you just put her in a home? This was a voice I didn't recognize, one of Meadow's newer friends from her book club. Meadow's laugh was sharp and calculating. Oh, believe me, I've looked into it. But Blaine gets all sentimental whenever I bring it up, says we can't just abandon his poor old mother. Her voice dripped with mock sympathy. What he doesn't understand is that she's the one abandoning us by being such a burden. My legs felt weak. I pressed myself against the wall, hidden from view but close enough to hear every word. Besides, Meadow continued, we're waiting for the inheritance situation to resolve itself, if you know what I mean. Blaine thinks she might have some savings tucked away, maybe a small life insurance policy. It would be stupid to move her out before we know what we're dealing with. Another voice chimed in, this one belonging to Sandra, a woman I'd met several times at family gatherings. How much longer can it be? Really? She's what, 70? And she looks older. That's the problem. Meadow sighed dramatically. She's healthier than she looks. Could live another 10 years for all we know. Meanwhile, I'm stuck playing nursemaid to someone who contributes absolutely nothing to this household. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I'd known Meadow didn't like me, but hearing her discuss my death like a business transaction was something I wasn't prepared for. What does she even do all day? Sandra asked. Oh, she keeps busy, Meadow said with bitter amusement. Cooking, cleaning, watching Judd when we need her to. Free labor, basically. I suppose there are some benefits to having her around. But honestly, the negatives outweigh the positives at this point. I heard footsteps and quickly realized someone was coming toward the kitchen. I slipped quietly up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it downstairs. Once safely in my room, I sat heavily on my bed, trying to process what I'd just heard. They were waiting for me to die, not hoping I'd live a long, healthy life surrounded by family who loved me, waiting for me to die so they could inherit whatever scraps they thought I might have left behind. And Blaine. My son knew about this conversation, had probably participated in others like it. The man I'd raised to be kind and compassionate was discussing my future like I was a stock option that hadn't matured yet. The worst part was how wrong they were about everything. about my financial situation, about my contributions to the household, about who I really was. They saw me as a burden, a placeholder taking up space until nature took its course. They had no idea that the old woman they were so eager to dispose of was actually in a position to change all their lives with a single phone call. Later that evening, after Meadow's friends had left and the house had settled into its usual routine, I made dinner as always. Blaine ate without looking up from his phone. Meadow picked at her food while scrolling through social media, and Judd wolfed down his meal before disappearing upstairs to play video games. "This chicken is a little dry," Meadow commented, not quite looking at me. "Maybe use less seasoning next time." I nodded silently, though the chicken was perfectly moist and seasoned exactly the way I'd been making it for decades. Meadow's criticism had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with establishing dominance. It was her way of reminding me of my place in the hierarchy. As I cleared the dishes, I listened to them discuss their weekend plans. A wine tasting for Meadow and her friends, a fishing trip for Blaine. Judd would stay with me, of course, which meant I'd spend my weekend entertaining a 12-year-old while they enjoyed their leisure time. "Mom," Blaine said suddenly, the first time he'd addressed me directly all evening. "Meadow and I have been talking about getting the house painted this spring. We'll need you to pack up your room so the painters can get in there." It wasn't a request. It was an instruction disguised as information. "Of course," I replied automatically. "Whatever you need." Meadow smiled with satisfaction, clearly pleased with my compliance. "It shouldn't take more than a day or two. You can sleep on the couch in the basement while they're working." The basement couch was old and uncomfortable, with a spring that poked through the cushions. They knew this, of course. It was just another small humiliation, another reminder that my comfort didn't matter. After they'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the clean dishes I'd just put away. For years, I'd told myself that family was worth any sacrifice, that love meant accepting whatever treatment I received without complaint. But what I'd heard today wasn't love. It wasn't even basic human decency. I thought about my investments, about the properties I owned, about the partnership in Morrison's market where they'd humiliated me. I thought about the bank accounts they knew nothing about, and the independence I'd been hiding like a shameful secret. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to remind everyone, including myself, exactly who Bessie really was underneath all this careful pretense. Maybe it was time to take my power back. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. While Meadow and Blaine slept in, and Judd was still getting ready for school, I quietly left the house and walked the 6 blocks to downtown. My first stop was Morrison's Market. Walking through those familiar aisles felt different now. Instead of shame from my recent humiliation, I felt something else entirely. This was partially my store. These shelves, these employees, this entire operation existed partly because of my investment and faith in Bill Morrison's vision all those years ago. I found Bill in his office behind the customer service counter, bent over invoices and looking every bit of his 68 years. When he saw me, his weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "Bessie, what brings you by so early?" I settled into the chair across from his desk, feeling more comfortable than I had in months. "I wanted to discuss our partnership, Bill. It's been a while since we've talked business." His expression grew more serious. "Everything all right? You sound different." "I'm thinking it might be time for me to take a more active role in operations," I said carefully. "I've been too hands-off for too long." Bill leaned back in his chair, studying me with interest. "What kind of active role are you thinking?" "I'd like to review our staffing policies, particularly regarding customer service training. And I think it's time I had an office here, somewhere I can oversee day-to-day operations." We spent the next hour going over financials, discussing operational changes, and planning my transition from silent partner to active business owner. Bill was enthusiastic about my involvement, admitting that he'd been hoping I'd want to take on more responsibility as he approached retirement age. "There's something else," I said as our meeting wound down. "I may need to make some changes to my will and business succession plans. Can you recommend an attorney who specializes in estate planning?" Bill's eyes sharpened with understanding. He'd known me long enough to read between the lines. Sarah Mitchell downtown. She's handled everything for my family. Discreet, thorough, and she doesn't judge anyone's family situations. My next stop was Sarah Mitchell's office. The attorney was a sharp woman in her 50s who listened without interruption as I explained my situation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "How long has your family been treating you this way?" she asked finally. "It's gotten progressively worse over the past 5 years, since my daughter-in-law moved in. But honestly, I think I've been enabling it by not standing up for myself." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "What you're describing sounds like financial abuse. Even if they don't realize the full extent of your assets. The fact that they're making decisions about your living situation and future care without your input is concerning." She pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. "Let's start with your current will. Who are your beneficiaries?" "Blaine, my son, is the primary beneficiary. I have a smaller bequest for my grandson Judd, and some charitable donations." "And you want to change this?" I took a deep breath. "I want to remove Blaine entirely. I want to set up a trust for Judd that he can access when he turns 25, assuming he maintains a relationship with me based on respect, not obligation. And I want to significantly increase my charitable giving." Sarah made notes as I spoke. "What about your business interests?" "I want to maintain control during my lifetime, but I'm thinking about different options for after I'm gone. Maybe employee ownership, maybe selling my shares back to Bill, maybe something else entirely. What I don't want is my son and his wife getting control of businesses they don't understand and didn't build." We spent 2 hours going over options, discussing trust structures and planning a comprehensive estate overhaul. Sarah explained that the changes I wanted would take several weeks to finalize, but she could start the paperwork immediately. "There's one more thing," I said as I prepared to leave. "I want everything done with complete confidentiality. My family cannot know about any of these changes until after they're finalized." "Of course. Attorney-client privilege protects all our communications. But Bessie, can I give you some personal advice?" I nodded. "Don't let fear of their reaction keep you from protecting yourself. You have every right to change your mind about your legacy, especially if your beneficiaries are treating you poorly. Your money is yours to do with as you see fit." Walking home, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since Meadow had moved in, I was taking action instead of just enduring. I was remembering that I had choices, that I didn't have to accept whatever treatment they decided to give me. When I arrived home, Meadow was in the kitchen making herself a smoothie. She glanced up at me with mild irritation. "Where were you? I needed you to watch Judd this morning, but you just disappeared." "I had some errands to run," I replied calmly. "Business matters." She looked puzzled. "What kind of business matters?" "Personal affairs," I said, moving to start lunch preparation. Meadow's frown deepened. "What personal affairs? You don't have any business." I continued chopping vegetables, not responding to her probing. For once, her confusion didn't bother me. In fact, I found it almost amusing. She was so certain she knew everything about my life, so confident in her assumption that I was nothing more than a dependent old woman with no resources or options. "Bessie," her voice carried a note of warning now, "I asked you a question." I looked up at her, meeting her eyes directly for perhaps the first time in years. And I answered it. I had personal business to attend to. Something in my tone must have surprised her because she stepped back slightly, her smoothie forgotten. "Well," she said after a moment, clearly flustered, "next time you need to let someone know where you're going. We worry when you just disappear." I almost laughed at that. The woman who'd spent yesterday afternoon discussing my death with her friends was suddenly concerned about my whereabouts. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, returning to my vegetables. As I prepared lunch, I thought about the documents Sarah would be drawing up, about the new office I'd soon have at Morrison's Market, about all the changes that were coming. Meadow and Blaine had no idea that their comfortable world was about to shift dramatically, but I did. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to tomorrow. 2 weeks had passed since my visits to Bill and Sarah, and the legal papers were finally ready. I'd spent those days observing my family with new eyes, watching their casual cruelty and entitled assumptions with a detachment that surprised me. Every dismissive comment, every order disguised as a request, every moment they treated me like hired help only strengthened my resolve. This morning felt different. There was a weight to it, like the air before a thunderstorm. I made breakfast as usual, served it without comment, and watched as they ate without acknowledging my efforts. Blaine scrolled through his phone. Meadow planned her day aloud, and Judd ate quickly before rushing off to catch his school bus. At precisely 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. Meadow looked up from her magazine with annoyance. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked me accusingly, as if any visitor to the house must be my responsibility. "I'll get it," I said calmly, smoothing my hands over my apron. Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch, professional and composed in her navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Behind her was a younger man I didn't recognize. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison. I'm here to deliver some documents we discussed." Meadow appeared behind me almost immediately, her curiosity overriding her usual disregard for my activities. "Who is this?" she demanded. "This is my attorney, Sarah Mitchell," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "And I believe you have something for me?" Sarah nodded, opening her briefcase and withdrawing a thick envelope. "The documents you requested, all properly executed and filed. And this is James Morrison, Bill Morrison's son, and the attorney handling the business transfer paperwork." "Business transfer?" Meadow's voice had risen an octave. "What business transfer?" I took the envelope from Sarah, feeling its weight in my hands. Years of careful planning, decades of quiet investments, and a lifetime of underestimation had led to this moment. "Perhaps we should all sit down," I suggested, leading them to the living room. Blaine emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the unusual activity. His face showed confusion as he took in the two attorneys, the formal atmosphere, and his mother holding official-looking documents. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, settling onto the couch next to Meadow. I remained standing, the envelope still unopened in my hands. "I thought it was time you both knew the truth about our family's financial situation." Meadow's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "3 weeks ago, you called me the maid in front of strangers," I said quietly. "You laughed when the cashier treated me with disrespect. You've spent years making me feel like a burden, like someone whose only value was in the unpaid labor I provided." "Mom," Blaine started, but I held up my hand. "Let me finish. Last week I overheard you discussing my death with your friends, Meadow, talking about how much longer you'd have to deal with me, and speculating about what little inheritance I might leave behind." Meadow's face flushed red. "You were eavesdropping. In my own home," I interrupted. "Yes, I was. And what I heard made me realize that you have no idea who I actually am." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document. "This is a notification that I've removed both of you from my will. Judd will receive a trust fund when he turns 25, assuming he can learn to treat me with basic human decency. Everything else goes to charity." The color drained from Blaine's face. "Mom, you can't be serious. We're family." "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me," I said firmly. "But that's not the most important thing you need to know." James Morrison stepped forward, opening his own briefcase. "Mrs. Harrison, should I proceed with the disclosure?" I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Tell them about Morrison's Market first." "Mrs. Harrison owns 40% of Morrison's Market," James announced matter-of-factly. "She's been a silent partner for 15 years and, as of yesterday, has assumed active management duties." Meadow's mouth fell open. "That's impossible. She doesn't have any money." "She also owns controlling interests in 3 other grocery stores in the county," James continued. 4 rental properties downtown, and a successful property management company that oversees 12 commercial buildings. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched as the reality of my words sank in, as years of assumptions crumbled before their eyes. "How much?" Blaine whispered. "How much are we talking about?" Sarah consulted her notes. "Liquid assets, business holdings, and real estate portfolio combined? Conservative estimate is $47 million. Meadow made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. She gripped the arm of the couch, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric. 47 million, she repeated numbly. You've had $47 million this entire time? I've had the foundation for it, I corrected. I built it piece by piece, investment by investment, while you treated me like hired help, while you discussed putting me in the cheapest nursing home you could find, while you waited for me to die so you could inherit my little nest egg. Blaine stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think what? I asked sharply. That you were doing me a favor by letting me live in this house? That I should be grateful for your scraps of attention and occasional kindness? We would have treated you differently if we'd known, Meadow said desperately. Exactly, I replied. You would have treated me differently because of my money, not because I'm a human being who deserves respect. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Sarah cleared her throat professionally. There's one more thing. Mrs. Harrison has also purchased this house from you, Mr. Harrison. Your mortgage was transferred to her company yesterday. You have 30 days to find alternative living arrangements. The devastation on their faces was complete now. Blaine sat down heavily, his head in his hands. Meadow stared at me with something approaching horror, as if I'd suddenly revealed myself to be a stranger. You can't do this, she whispered. This is our home, Judd's home. This was my home first, I said calmly. I've lived here for 22 years. You've lived here for 5, and in those 5 years, you've made it clear that my presence here is unwelcome. I gathered the documents back into their envelope, feeling lighter with each passing moment. The attorneys will handle all the details. I'll be staying at a hotel downtown until I finalize my other arrangements. As I walked toward the stairs to pack my things, Blaine called after me, his voice breaking. Mom, please. We can work this out. We can change. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, not turning around. I'm 70 years old, Blaine. I don't have time left to wait for you to learn how to love me properly. 6 months later, I sat on the terrace of my villa overlooking Lake Como, watching the morning sun paint the Italian mountains in shades of gold and rose. The espresso in my delicate porcelain cup was perfect, prepared by Elena, my housekeeper, who treated me with the kind of natural respect I'd almost forgotten existed. The transition hadn't been immediate. After leaving Blaine and Meadow's house that day, I'd spent 3 weeks in a downtown hotel while Sarah and her team conducted a complete audit of my assets. The final tally had been staggering, even to me. $50 million. 50 years of careful investing, quiet business dealings, and compound growth had created wealth I'd never fully calculated. I'd underestimated my own success. With Sarah's help, I'd liquidated several properties, consolidated my investments, and structured my finances for international living. The grocery stores were sold to my employees through a generous buyout program. The rental properties went to a management company with instructions to keep rents affordable for working families. I kept only what I needed for a comfortable life, far away from the people who'd made me feel small. Choosing Italy hadn't been difficult. I'd always dreamed of seeing the world, but those dreams had been set aside for more practical concerns. Now, with unlimited time and resources, I could finally live the life I'd deferred for decades. The villa was perfect. Not ostentatious, but elegant. 3 bedrooms, each with French doors opening onto gardens that spilled down toward the lake. A library filled with books I actually had time to read. A kitchen where I cooked because I enjoyed it, not because anyone expected it of me. Elena knocked softly on the terrace door, carrying the cordless phone. Signora Bessie, there is a call from America. A young man named Judd. My grandson had called every week since I'd left, at first angry and confused, then gradually more thoughtful as time passed. Our conversations had evolved from accusations to curiosity to something approaching understanding. Grandma? His voice was deeper now, changing with adolescence. How are you? I'm wonderful, sweetheart. How are things at home? There was a pause. Different. Mom and Dad are getting divorced. Mom moved out last month. I wasn't surprised. Without the fantasy of a substantial inheritance holding them together, their marriage had no foundation. Meadow had likely moved on to find another target for her manipulations. Are you okay? I asked gently. Yeah, I think so. Dad's been asking about you a lot. He wants to call you. And what do you think about that? Another pause, longer this time. I think he's finally figuring out that he messed up really bad. But I also think he's only sorry because he found out about your money. The wisdom in his words surprised me. At 13, Judd was developing the kind of emotional intelligence his parents had never possessed. What about you? I asked. Are you sorry about the money, or are you sorry about how we treated each other? I'm sorry I laughed at you that day in the store, he said quietly. I knew it was wrong when I did it, but I wanted Mom and Dad to think I was funny. That was stupid. My throat tightened with emotion. Thank you for saying that. It means more to me than you know. Grandma, could I maybe come visit you sometime? Not because of the money or anything, just because I miss you. I smiled, looking out over the pristine lake where a small boat was cutting through the morning calm. I would love that, but only when you're old enough to travel alone, and only if you want to come for the right reasons. I do. I want to see where you live now. Dad showed me pictures online. It looks beautiful. After we hung up, I sat quietly with my thoughts. Judd was the one good thing to come out of my years with Blaine and Meadow. He was young enough to learn, to grow, to become better than his parents. Maybe there was hope for at least one relationship to be salvaged from the wreckage. Blaine had tried calling numerous times, but I'd refused to take his calls. His messages, relayed through Judd, were variations on the same theme. He was sorry, he'd changed, he wanted to make things right. But I'd heard similar promises before, usually when he needed something. This time, the need was just bigger. Elena appeared again, this time carrying a silver tray with fresh fruit and the morning mail. Among the letters was one with familiar handwriting. Meadows' looping script was unmistakable. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. Inside was 3 pages of alternating threats and pleas. She demanded I help her with her legal fees for the divorce. She threatened to prevent me from seeing Judd. She promised to change if I'd reconsider my will. She accused me of destroying their family out of spite. I folded the letter carefully and carried it to the stone fireplace in my sitting room. The flames consumed it quickly, leaving nothing but ash and the faint smell of smoke. Some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt. That afternoon, I walked through the village market, practicing my growing Italian vocabulary with the vendors who'd become my friends. Signora Martinez, who sold the most beautiful flowers I'd ever seen, insisted on giving me extra roses for my dining room table. Giuseppe, the baker, saved the best loaves of bread for my weekly visits. These people knew nothing about my money or my past. They simply enjoyed my company, and I enjoyed theirs. This was what family should feel like: warm, welcoming, uncomplicated by hidden agendas or unspoken resentments. That evening, I called my financial advisor in New York to discuss my latest charitable contributions: a foundation for elderly people experiencing family neglect, scholarships for single mothers starting their own businesses, a fund to help people escape toxic family situations. My money was finally being used for something meaningful, something that reflected my values rather than enabling people who'd never learned to value me. As the sun set over Lake Como, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I raised my glass of wine in a quiet toast. To second chances, to late-blooming independence, to the radical act of choosing yourself when no one else will. I was 70 years old, and my real life was just beginning. The woman who'd been called the maid in a grocery store 6 months ago was now living like the queen she'd always been inside. And the best part? This was just the beginning of my story, not the end. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.